Good evening, and welcome back. The fire's burning low and slow tonight, and that's okay. We'll just let the flames curl lazily around half-burned logs and let the storm wander where it will. Because tonight, beyond the firelight and storm, London awaits. Not the London of neon signs and impatient horns. No, this is Whitechapel, the East End, in the fog-filled autumn of 1888.
London in 1888 was a living, breathing labyrinth, its streets twisting like veins through the heart of an ancient city. Whitechapel was the place where those veins darkened, a district the well-heeled avoided, its name spoken in drawing rooms with a shudder. Under the reign of Queen Victoria, the city was a place of contrasts. The West End glittered with theatres, music halls and gaslit promenades. While here, in the East End, the poor crowded into lodging houses and rotting tenements, their lives hemmed in by hunger, grime, and the unshakable knowledge that the world had been built to forget them. By day, Whitechapel was a place of noise and grit, hawkers calling out their wares from behind rickety stalls, the metallic ring of a blacksmith's hammer echoing down narrow courts, and the clatter of wooden cart wheels rattling over uneven stones. Thick, black smog drifted over from the West End factories, coiling into the alleys and hanging low over the market stalls. The docks sent up the pungent tang of fish and sea, and from beneath the houses, cesspools and drains breathed the stench so foul it clung to your hair and clothes, marking you as one of Whitechapel's own long after you'd left. Life on the East End was a kind of constant negotiation with hardship. Never enough warmth, never enough bread, never enough quiet. But by night, well, that was when the East End took on another face. The gas lamps, perched like tired sentinels, bled amber light into the fog, leaving more shadow than safety. The air grew heavier, a damp mixture of coal smoke, hoarse sweat, and the slow, fetid exhale of the gutters. To be heard was the rhythmic clop of hooves, the scrape of boots over wet cobbles, and the faint hiss of gaslight mantles feeding their glow. From somewhere in the warren of courts and passages, a lone violin might rise and fall, its melody quickly swallowed by the hum of the city. Men in bowler hats leaned against doorways, their cigarettes glowing faintly in the mist. Women, some wrapped in shawls, others in dresses that had seen better days, stood in pools of lamplight, their eyes sharp beneath wide-brimmed hats. A constable's lantern swayed in the gloom, the halo of its light shrinking and growing with each step. Plainly stated, here in Whitechapel, the streets never truly slept. They merely shifted.
The whole of East End beat to its own rhythm, not the measured ticking of Parliament's grand clock, nor the stately bells of St. Paul's, but rather the restless percussion of survival. London in 1888 was an empire's jewel, but a jewel set in a crown too heavy for many to bear. Under Queen Victoria's long reign, the city swelled with industry, wealth and invention. The West End sparkled, gaslit theatres spilling warm light onto clean swept streets, grand hotels with liveried doormen, carriages polished until they gleamed like black mirrors. Ladies in silk bustled along Bond Street, gloves buttoned high, parasols angled against the weak sun, while their escorts spoke in low, amused tones about Parliament's latest debates. It was the London of progress, of imperial pride, of tea poured from silver pots into fine china cups. The newspapers told of triumphs, new bridges, electric lighting, colonies expanding under the Union Jack. It was a world of confidence, of the assurance that the sun would never set on the British Empire. But the same city, only a few miles east, told a different story, one the Queen herself would never walk through, though she surely knew it existed. There, the streets were lined, not with carriages, but with handcarts pulled by men whose shoulders stooped from years of toil. There were no silks, no parasols, only worn shawls and boots with soles patched in layers of scrap leather. The East End was the capital's hidden ledger, the other side of the balance sheet. While the west feasted, the east scraped by. There was no gentle clinking of silver spoons, only the scrape of tin forks on chipped enamel plates. No music from concert halls, only the shuffle of tired feet and the occasional thin notes of a fiddle played for pennies. The classes might live in the same city, but they inhabited entirely separate worlds. The Thames ran between them like a line on a map, not just of geography, but of fortune and fate, and nowhere was that divide more visible or more cruel than in Whitechapel. Here, the grandeur of empire was as far away as the moon. Its shadow fell long, but its light did not reach the streets of Whitechapel. Here, the buildings leaned in on one another, like old men whispering confidences they'd carried too long. The brick was blackened from decades of soot, the windows so caked with grime that even midday sun entered as little more than a tired grey sigh, much like the spirit of the Providence. And yet, the streets swelled with humanity. Dock workers, smelling of tar and the Thames, trudged home with shoulders stooped from hauling for other men's fortunes. Seamstresses hurried by, shawls drawn tight, their fingertips pricked and raw from long hours spent sewing under candlelight. Costermongers pushed handcarts heavy with bruised apples and wilted cabbages, calling out their prices in voices hoarse from the cold. And always, moving between them, were the women the polite classes pretended not to see, cheeks painted too bright, eyes scanning every passing face not for warmth, but for the weight of coins in a pocket. Here, night was not a curtain to draw over the day. It was an unblinking stare, and it was not kind. By the time the lamps were lit, the streets belonged to the desperate. Some were desperate for work, some for food, and some, ah yes, desperate for the sort of satisfaction that only cruelty could bring. Whitechapel's filth was not always something you stepped in along the gutters. Sometimes it tipped its bowler hat to you as it passed by, smiling without ever reaching the eyes. Hope, when it came, was rationed. For many, each day's purpose was simply to endure, to make it through another dawn without having lost more than you had to spare. It was a slow erosion of spirit, the kind that ground people down without ceremony. And yet, against all odds, there were still moments when the fog thinned and the light of life slipped through. Whitechapel could laugh too when it had cause. Inside the 10 Bells, beer sloshed from tankards as old friends slapped each other's backs and shouted over the din. In cramped kitchens, mothers hummed to restless babies, the lullabies rising above the scrape of wooden chairs on bare floors. For an hour or two, the world beyond those walls might be forgotten until the wind rattled the window pane, or the boots of a constable echoed too slowly past the door. Because beneath every note of momentary laughter, there was an undercurrent, a quiet instinct that never left you, the knowledge that danger could step from any shadow, and that it did not need an invitation. Fog in Whitechapel was not the romantic kind that poets and parlours wrote about. It was not gentle nor mysterious in any charming sense. Here, the fog was a living thing, a damp grey animal that coiled through the alleys and gnawed at the edges of every lamp's light. It crept from the Thames, heavy with the stink of low tide, and the refuse the water could not swallow. It slid along the gutters, curling around the ankles of those who hurried past, and clung to the collars of coats long after they'd gone indoors. The lamps fought it, but their glow was swallowed whole just beyond arm's reach, leaving the streets to their own shadows. In the daylight, this fog was little more than a nuisance, an inconvenience to the shopkeeper squinting at his accounts, or the matron beating her rugs. But when the sun dipped, it became something else entirely. It was a veil for those who preferred not to be seen, and a blindfold for those who wished they could see less. You could stand on a street corner and hear the world without seeing it, the wheeze of a cartwheel dragging over cobblestone, the hushed transaction of coins sliding from one palm to another, the low murmur of two voices leaning too close to be casual, and somewhere the scrape of a shoe that might have followed you from the last turning. Even the architecture seemed to conspire with the fog. The crooked alleys bent sharply, cutting off sightlines, their walls too close for comfort. Wooden staircases climbed to second floors that leaned out over the street, casting permanent shadows below. For those who knew the East End well, the fog was simply another hazard to navigate, like the slick cobbles or the quick hands of a pickpocket. But for the uninitiated, for the ones who stumbled here by mistake, it was disorienting enough to make them feel like prey. Not all who disappeared into Whitechapel's fog were found again. Some slipped away willingly, seeking the anonymity it offered. Others were simply gone, swallowed whole by streets that did not care to give them back. This was Whitechapel, alive, unpolished and uneasy, a place where a stranger could vanish into the press of the crowd, and where the wrong turn on the wrong night could be the last wrong move you'd ever make.
In Whitechapel, survival was its own occupation. It didn't come with wages or hours, only the constant demand to keep moving, keep finding, keep scraping enough together to see another dawn. The working poor rose before the sun, their breath misting in the chill as they joined the shuffle toward factories, docks or building sites. Men laboured in the roar and stink of the shipyards, clothes stiff with salt and grease. Others found work in slaughterhouses where the floor was always wet and the air carried the iron tang of blood. There were no masks, no safety guards, only calloused hands and aching backs by day's end. For women, the options were fewer and crueler. Some took in laundry until their skin cracked from lye and hot water. Others stitched until candlelight burned their eyes to blurs. Many took to the streets, not because they wished to, but because a night's risk meant the difference between eating and starving. Children were part of the machinery too. Boys ran errands for shopkeepers or carried coal in sacks nearly their own size. Girls tended siblings while their mothers worked or picked over heaps of refuse in search of pretties to sell for pennies. School was a luxury most would never know. And still, despite the endless grind, there were those who played the angles. The costermonger with a sharp eye for who'd pay extra for the freshest apple, the pub owner who watered down the gin but charged full price, the pawnbroker who knew desperation would force a man to sell his coat in winter. It was a place where you learned quickly whom to trust and whom to avoid. A bad decision could cost your day's wages, your health or your life. When the day's work was done, if you were lucky enough to find it, there was still the matter of a bed. Lodging houses charged by the night, and those without coins might pay for nothing more than the right to lean over a taut rope strung across the room, half sleeping on their feet until morning. There was no cushion here, no margin for error. The machinery of survival demanded you feed it every single day. And if you couldn't, well, the streets always had room for one more.
Whitechapel was not faceless. It was an endless tapestry of worn expressions and restless eyes of people moving through the same streets yet living in entirely different worlds. There was the dock worker, broad-shouldered, arms knotted with ropey muscle, the smell of brine and tar clinging to him like a second skin. His boots, crusted with salt, slapped the cobbles in time with the shifting tide. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried the slow weight of a man who had seen too much weather and too many losses. Near the market stall stood the street seller, his cry cutting through the fog as sharp as the knife he used to peel bruised apples. His cart was a ramshackle thing, a patchwork of nailed boards, its wheels squealing with each turn. He knew the neighbourhood gossip better than the parish beadle and could barter in a dozen dialects. The constable, always moving at a steady pace, lantern swaying in the mist, truncheon at his side, his greatcoat brushing against his knees as he scanned the narrow alleys with the weary suspicion of a man who knew the trouble was never more than a shadow away. He was respected by some, despised by others, but all kept one eye on him. Then there was the weary mother, shawl pulled tight against the damp. A child clung to her skirts, another rode her hip, their faces pale and thin. She walked with her head down, eyes scanning the street for any small kindness. A coin dropped in haste, a smile from someone who remembered better days. And, of course, there were the women who lingered near the pubs and lodging houses, their rouge a little too bright, their laughter a shade too loud. They leaned into the glow of gaslight, watching for the man who might buy them a drink, or perhaps something more. Some were hardened to it, others barely old enough to have left girlhood behind. In the background, always, were the children, darting between legs, chasing after wheels, calling out in high, thin voices that carried even through the fog. They played with buttons and bottle caps, with sticks and balls, finding games where there was nothing else to be had. Every street corner, every narrow court, every shadowed doorway told a story. Most would never be written down, never be remembered beyond the people who lived them. But together, they made up the beating heart of Whitechapel, a heart that was stubborn, tired, and impossibly fragile. And it was among these faces, in the ebb and flow of the crowd, that Mary Ann Polly Nichols moved, a woman on the edge of her own unraveling, though neither she nor the streets yet knew it.
Mary Ann Nichols was born in 1845, the daughter of a blacksmith, a trade of iron and callus, where the sparks flew hot and the work was never done. Her early years were the sort that seldom leave a mark in history books. A modest home in Camberwell, the smell of coal dust from her father's clothes, and the unremarkable rhythm of working-class Victorian life. She grew into a slim young woman with dark hair, a shy smile, and eyes that, even then, seemed to hold something unspoken. At 18, she married William Nichols, a printer's machinist, and for a time, her life seemed set on a familiar track. They had children, 5 in all, and lived in small but decent lodgings, the kind where the wallpaper curled at the seams, but a fire still burned in the grate. But life in the working poor was a delicate balance, and it didn't take much to tilt it. Arguments began to fester, money thinned, and whispers of Polly's drinking grew louder. By 1881, the marriage had unraveled beyond mending. She left William, or was turned out, depending on who told the story, and began her long, slow drift through the shadows of the East End. In those years, Polly was often a resident of London's common lodging houses, the last rung before the street itself. For a few pennies a night, you got a narrow bed in a room of many, your own blanket if you were lucky, and the constant noise of others who, like you, had nowhere else to go. It was here, in these echoing dormitories, that Polly's name began to blur into the tide of women scraping by with whatever they could. A day's cleaning work, a bit of sewing, or selling herself for the price of a bed and a drink. She had moments of climbing back towards something better. There were positions as a domestic servant, promises to stay sober, attempts to reconnect with her children. But the pull of poverty and the escape of gin were relentless companions. Each time she stumbled, the climb back grew steeper. By the summer of 1888, Polly was 43, though the years had etched deeper lines into her face. Her dark hair, streaked now with grey, was often hidden beneath a battered bonnet. She was known for being jolly when she'd had a bit of drink, and quiet when she hadn't. Friends said she was friendly, but carried a sadness she didn't speak of. In August, she found work as a domestic in Wandsworth, caring for a well-off family. It might have been a fresh start, but after only a few months she left, perhaps unable to resist the pull of her old haunts, perhaps pushed out by her own habits. Either way, She returned to the lodging houses of Spitalfields, her belongings pared down to what she could carry. That last week of her life was much like the weeks before it, short bursts of earning followed by longer hours of drinking and walking the streets. On the night of August 30th, Polly found herself without the fourpence needed for a bed at her lodging house. She told the deputy she'd soon return with her DOS money. She stepped into the night, the fog curling around the gas lamps, the cobblestones damp beneath her boots. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the passing hours. She likely thought only of finding a customer, making her bed money, and maybe enough for a drink before dawn. But the streets had other plans for Polly Nichols. Somewhere out there in the labyrinth of Whitechapel, a shadow moved with its own intent. It was patient, it was watching, and soon their paths would cross.
The night of Thursday, August 30th, 1888, slid quietly over Whitechapel. The fog hung low, wrapping itself around the crooked chimneys and lamplights, like a thief in no hurry. It muted the clatter of carts, softened the hiss of gas lamps, and swallowed the stars whole. Inside the common lodging houses, fires burned low, voices dropped to murmurs, and the streets outside took on their other life, the one that belonged to those who earned their keep in darkness. Polly Nichols stepped from the doorway of the lodging house just past midnight. She had no money for a bed, but her spirits were oddly light, buoyed by gin and the stubborn optimism of someone who believed she could make her luck before the night was through. She wore a black straw bonnet with a small brim, a brown dress, and a dark, weather-worn jacket that did little to keep out the chill. Her boots clicked over the cobblestones, each step carrying her deeper into the warren of streets and alleys. She passed shop fronts long closed for the night, their windows dark as blind eyes. Somewhere to her left, a pub door banged open, spilling the sound of laughter into the fog before it was swallowed again. She wandered toward Whitechapel Road, scanning the corners for opportunity. A constable passed her and nodded. She returned the gesture and kept walking. There was nothing unusual about her presence here. She was one of dozens of women who braved the streets after dark, each hoping to earn the small coins that kept them from a night on bare ground. Sometime between 1 and 2 in the morning, Polly was seen speaking to another woman outside the Frying Pan pub. She seemed cheerful, even teasing about the jolly bonnet she wore, as if it were proof her fortunes would turn before dawn. Then she drifted east, toward Bucks Row, a street darker and quieter than most, where the lamps stood farther apart and the shadows were deeper. It was the kind of street where footsteps sounded louder than they should, where the stillness made you wonder who or what might be keeping pace just out of sight. At some point in those quiet, unseen minutes, Polly was no longer alone. Whether he stepped from an alley or melted from the fog, no one could say, but there, beneath the dim cast of a gas lamp, she and the figure paused. There may have been a word, a laugh, perhaps even the clink of coins changing hands, and then they moved together into a darker place. The discovery came, it was just before 4 in the morning. A carman named Charles Cross was making his way down Bucks Row when his lantern beam caught the shape of a woman lying on her back, skirts rucked up around her waist. At first he thought she was drunk, but as he drew nearer, the truth crept cold into his bones. Polly's throat had been cut, not once, but twice, the wounds deep and deliberate. Her face, pale in the half-light, was turned toward the sky as if in surprise. Her hands lay still at her sides, and though it was not obvious in that moment, more violence had been done. Hidden beneath the modesty of her blood-drenched clothing, a cruelty precise and unflinching. The police were called. Constable John Neal arrived within minutes, his boots crunching softly on the cobbles. The flicker of his lantern cast long, uneasy shadows as he examined the scene. The night around them seemed to hold its breath, as though even the fog knew something terrible had taken its first step. Mary Ann Nichols, Polly, was gone, and in her place,
lay the opening chapter of a horror that would grip London by the throat, while somewhere in the maze of Whitechapel, a man walked away unseen, his blade cleaned, his pace unhurried, his appetite only just awakened. Dawn in Whitechapel was never gentle. It arrived not with the slow yawn of birdsong, but with the clatter of carts, the bark of traders, and the hiss of steam from kitchens firing up for the day. But on Friday, August 31st, 1888, the first light felt different, thinner somehow, as though even the sun hesitated to touch Buck's Row. By the time the fog began to thin, word of the night's discovery had already passed from mouth to ear and back again. It rode the breath of market women as they set out their baskets of apples and onions, and curled into the ear of the butcher as he hung his cuts in the window. Men at the docks spoke of it in low voices, glancing toward the alleys, as if half expecting to see something moving there still. The police cordoned off the area, their dark uniforms and polished buttons a grim counterpoint to the pale shape now shrouded in a coarse sheet. Constables stood with their hands clasped behind their backs, eyes fixed anywhere but the ground at their feet. At the mortuary, the body of Mary Ann Nichols was laid out beneath the cool light of the morning. A coroner, grave-faced and deliberate, took down his first notes, remarking on the depth of the cuts to her throat, the careful, almost practiced nature of the violence that had been perpetrated to the whole of her body. His words were professional, but the way his pen slowed told its own story. Back in the streets, the talk was quick and nervous. Some whispered it was a drunken quarrel gone too far. Others muttered about gangs, or sailors from the docks, or some phantom who'd been seen in the shadows one too many times. A few, remembering other unsolved horrors, began to wonder if London had something worse on its hands. The press caught wind before midday. Reporters with ink-stained fingers jotted down witness statements, real and imagined, their headlines growing sharper with every retelling. Ghastly murder in Whitechapel screamed from the evening editions, the words as much an invitation to fear as to curiosity. Shopkeepers found excuses to keep their doors open later that night, lanterns burning in their windows like sentries against the dark. Women in the lodging houses clung a little closer to one another, their laughter forced, their eyes darting toward the windows whenever a footstep passed in the street. Still, life in the East End did not stop. It could not stop. Children still ran between the stalls, the costermongers still called their wares, the pubs still filled with smoke and talk as the lamps lit once more. But underneath it all was something new, a tension that hummed just below the surface, a shared knowledge that one of their own had met her end in a way that felt less like bad luck and more like a promise. No one could name him yet. No one knew if he had walked these streets before or if he was only now beginning to claim them. But the night had changed something. In Buck's Row, the cobblestones had already been washed, the traces of blood thinned to nothing by pail after pail of water. Still, some swore they could smell the metallic tang if the wind turned just so. Mary Ann Nichols was buried in a pauper's grave, not far from the streets where she had walked her final hours. Few came to stand by the unmarked earth. Life in Whitechapel had taught its people to carry their grief quietly. But those who had seen her, as she was found or as she was remembered, carried something else as well. A suspicion, a fear, and though no one dared say it aloud, a grim certainty that the shadow that had taken her was not yet done. The first week after Polly Nichols' death
Whitechapel carried on, but not quite the same. Voices in the public houses dropped when strangers came in. Women glanced over their shoulders more often. The air was still thick with coal smoke and dock smells, but now it carried something sharper, a tension that clung to the skin, and the newspapers helped it along. Every day brought another article, another headline sharpened like a blade. Horrible murder in Whitechapel, ghastly crime in Bucks Row. The reporters painted the scene in words as vivid as any crime painter. The slashed throat, the mutilation of bowel and bone, the dark hour, the narrow street where death had waited in the fog. They filled in the blanks where facts failed them, and the public devoured every word. In the lodging houses, women spoke in whispers, recalling what they'd heard from friends of friends, that the killer was a foreign sailor, that he was a butcher with a taste for cruelty, that he was a ghost from the alleys who could melt into brick. None of them knew, but all of them feared. And yet, life pressed forward. On the better-kept streets, boots still shined, and shop windows still held neat rows of biscuits and tea tins. In places like Hanbury Street, a step up from the warren of courts and alleys, the air felt almost respectable. Number 29 Hanbury Street stood in such a place. It belonged to a woman named Amelia Richardson, a hard-working soul who ran a packing case business from her cellar. She shared an upper room with her 14-year-old son and rented the rest out to tenants. 8 rooms in all, holding 17 people in total, but by East End standards, this was not an overabundance of souls. Many had steady jobs, and Amelia, charitable to a fault, even lent sleeping space to an elderly widow who could not pay. There was only one way into the house, a narrow front passageway, barely 3 feet wide and 20 feet long. The walls seemed to press in as you walked through it, until the space opened into a staircase, rising upward, and a continuation toward the back door. Beyond that, 3 stone steps led down into a small square yard, its edges hemmed in by thin fences no more than 5 feet high. In one corner sat the outdoor lavatory. The yard was entirely enclosed, accessible only through the house itself. The front and back doors were left unlocked, as many were. There was nothing worth stealing, and all were aware. It was in many ways a quiet place, but not so quiet that it didn't see its share of shadowed business. Women of the night sometimes brought clients there, slipping through the narrow passage into the back, conducting their affairs in hushed tones beneath the cover of deep dark. Still, by the measures of Whitechapel, number 29 was a solid, lived-in home. The kind of place where the smell of tea and baking bread could mask the rot of the city beyond. But even here, in the better parts of the bad side of East End, the whispers seeped in. The lodgers had read the papers. They had walked past Bucks Row. They had seen the fear in the faces of women heading home late. And somewhere, though no one could prove it, there was the sense that the one who had taken Polly Nichols was not done. That he was out there, blending into the crowd, watching, waiting. The fog rolled in thicker at night now, not the soft curling mist of autumn, but a heavier, oilier shroud that blurred the gas lamps into pale halos and made every footstep sound closer than it should. The constables patrolled with their lamps swinging, but even their presence did little to ease the gnawing awareness that the streets no longer belonged just to those who dwelled there. People began to keep count. One woman, dead in Bucks Row. One shadow, unnamed. One fear, growing with every fog-wrapped night. The dawn of Saturday, September 8th, 1888 broke slow and sullen over Whitechapel. It was the kind of morning where the fog didn't lift so much as fade reluctantly, inch by inch, until the shapes of buildings and people began to emerge, like ghosts deciding to stay a while longer. Chapman was among those shapes,
a small woman, 47 years old, moving with the weariness of someone who had lived hard and long. She had once been a wife and mother in a comfortable home. She had once known the feel of good fabric in her hands and the taste of warm bread she had baked herself. But those days had slipped from her grasp, one by one, lost to drink, to illness, and to the poverty that trailed both like a shadow. By the summer of '88, Annie was lodging at Crossingham's, a common lodging house on Dorset Street. The rules were simple. A bed for the night cost 4p, paid up front, no credit. If you didn't have it, you didn't stay. On that particular morning, Annie didn't have it. The deputy keeper told her plainly to earn her 4p or be sleeping rough. She'd nodded, as if it were no insult, only fact. That was the way of life for many women in the East End. You paid for the right to sleep inside, one night at a time. So Annie went out into the streets. The market stalls were just waking, their keepers stacking boxes of bruised apples, limp carrots and small bundles of wilted greens. The smell of wet wood mixed with the sharper tang of onions and cabbage leaves crushed underfoot. She moved through it all quietly, nodding to one or two familiar faces, but keeping the business of the moment in mind, she kept her pace. Number 29 stood as it always had, unremarkable to anyone passing by. Inside, the evening's lodgers had not yet begun to stir. The front door, as always, was unlocked. 3 stone steps, the cold of the night still clinging, led down to the small square space at the back. The lavatory stood in shadow, its door half hanging, the hinges complaining when moved. Above, the fences seemed even higher in the dim light, hemming the yard in like a box. And there, in that tight, enclosed place, the morning turned. It was quick, but not merciful. The blow was hard enough to take her down before she could cry out. The violence that followed was surgical in precision, yet savage in intent. A cruelty so complete that the coroner would later say it was as though the killer's hand had been guided by knowledge of anatomy. When the deed was done, the yard was silent again, save for the distant clatter of a costermonger's cart on the street beyond. It was just after 6 a.m. when John Davis, another lodger at number 29, stepped out into the yard. He was looking for the lavatory. Instead, he found Annie. The sight froze him. For a heartbeat, he could not comprehend what he was seeing. Then the shock broke, and he ran through the passage out into the street, shouting for help. Within minutes, Hanbury Street swarmed. Constables, curious onlookers, and the first eager reporters crowded at the front door. The yard became a crime scene, the small space packed with the sound of boots on stone, low voices trading grim observations, and the scratching of pencils against police notebooks. One constable swore under his breath and refused to describe what he had seen. Another crossed himself quickly, as if to ward off the memory. But the memory would not be warded off, not for them, not for Whitechapel. Polly Nichols had been the first, Annie Chapman was the second, and though no one dared to say it aloud just yet, a pattern had begun. By the afternoon of September 8th, Whitechapel was buzzing like a hive kicked over. Word of Annie Chapman's murder spread quickly, first from neighbour to neighbour, then spilling into the pubs, the market stalls, and the street corners where men leaned on lampposts to trade the latest scraps of rumour. By nightfall, it had reached the ears of Fleet Street's newspapermen, who wasted no time dressing the story in bold headlines and ink-black dread. The Star ran with, "Horrible murder in Whitechapel, another woman slain." The Daily Telegraph was sharper, "Monster at large, second victim in East End terror." Each paper fed the hunger for detail, laying out the coroner's grim facts alongside hearsay from market gossips and pub regulars. Some accounts had Annie's killer leaping over fences like a cat. Others claimed he had vanished through the very air. None agreed on everything, but all agreed on one. The brutality was unlike anything they'd ever known. The whispers on Hanbury Street swelled into something heavier, something more dangerous. The idea that there was not just a murderer, but a hunter loose among them. The East End had never been a place of perfect safety, but it had its own unspoken rules. Where you could walk, who you could trust, what risks you could take. But now, the rules seemed broken. Women who had once stood in the lamplight without a second thought began to keep to the deeper shadows, their eyes darting to every footstep behind them. Market traders who once left their stalls to fetch tea now asked a neighbour to watch them closely, not for fear of theft, but for fear of who might pass by while they were gone. The constables, their helmets glistening under the fog-hugged street lamps, were suddenly more visible. They walked their beats with a stiffer gait, their eyes sweeping alleys and doorways with the tightness of men who knew they were already too late.
It didn't take long for theories to grow legs. Some said the killer was a foreign sailor who docked in the Thames between voyages, vanishing back to sea after each crime. Others were certain it was a local man, someone who knew the maze of alleys and could slip away unseen. And then came the darker whispers, the ones traded only in low voices over tankards of ale, that this was no common killer, but a man with medical knowledge. The cuts, they said, were too precise. The taking of certain internal parts, too deliberate. A name had not yet been given to the shadow that haunted them, but it was taking form in the minds of the people, a shape that would soon grow sharper, darker, and more terrifying with every telling. In smoky editorial rooms, newspaper men recognized the story's power. Crime sold papers, but fear sold them faster. They wrote with a fever, turning 2 murders into a mounting saga. Some reporters prowled Dorset Street and Hanbury Street themselves, jotting down descriptions of the cobbles slick with drizzle, the dim gaslight, the expressions of women who pulled their shawls tighter at the mention of the crime. Others leaned on the police for scraps of information, then stretched those scraps into columns that made the killings sound like scenes from the penny dreadfuls. A few papers even hinted, without proof of course, that the murderer left some kind of signature, a calling card only the police understood. Whether true or not, it added to the growing image of a phantom that stalked the East End with purpose. By the week's end, the murders of Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman were no longer seen as separate tragedies. They were chapters in a story still being written, and everyone feared they knew the ending. The pubs filled each night with talk of the Whitechapel fiend, though no one yet dared to call him by the name that would one day be whispered across the world. The police presence swelled, and still the fear swelled faster. There were those who swore they saw him, a tall figure in black vanishing into the fog, a man with a parcel slipping into an alley, a stranger lingering at the edge of the market. But no matter how vivid the description, he was never there when the constable arrived. Whitechapel had always been a place of the working poor, of tight-knit communities bound by hardship. But now, suspicion began to curl between neighbours. A man who kept odd hours drew looks. A lodger who paid in cash but never seemed to work was whispered about. Even the policemen, once a rare comfort, were not above suspicion in some corners. What the people didn't yet realize was that the shadow had already chosen again. Somewhere in the warren of streets, he was watching, waiting, marking his next step. The panic was not misplaced. It was not hysteria. It was instinct, the kind that had kept humankind alive for centuries. But in Whitechapel, in the autumn of 1888, that instinct came too late for some. Berners Street was a quieter vein of Whitechapel. That quiet was a relative term in the East End. It lay in the shadow of the docks where the smell of brine and tar clung to the air, mingled with the faint sweetness of rotting fruit from the market carts. The cobbles here were narrower, the houses hunched close, their upper stories leaning toward each other like conspirators. The street was home to dock labourers, cart drivers, and a few small trades. A carpenter here, a seamstress there. But its most prominent building, was the International Working Men's Educational Club, a meeting place for immigrant labourers with a taste for political debate, strong tea, and the occasional heated argument that spilled into the street. On the night of September 29th, the club was lively. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of mutton stew from the kitchen. Voices rose and fell in English, Yiddish, and Russian. Outside, the night was damp, a fine drizzle turning the gas lamps into hazy halos. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolled 10. Elizabeth Stride, known to her friends as Long Liz, was a familiar figure in these streets. Born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden, she had come to London seeking work and, like so many women of the East End, had found herself caught in its undertow. She had cleaned rooms, sewn dresses, and, when times were lean, taken to the streets at night to make her rent. At 44, she was older than many of the women who worked the corners, and she carried herself with a certain dignity, neat in her dress, her dark hair pinned carefully, her boots polished even when her purse was light. She was known to be quick to smile, quick to scold, and never one to linger where she wasn't welcome. That particular evening, Liz was seen in the company of a man. Descriptions varied, as they always did. Some said he was short and stocky with a dark moustache. Others swore he was taller, better dressed, carrying a small parcel. What was certain was that Liz was not in a hurry. She was seen laughing softly, pausing in the lamplight, then walking on into the drizzle. By midnight, the street had thinned to a few stragglers. A costermonger wheeled his empty cart home, its wooden wheels grumbling against the stones. The last of the club's latecomers slipped inside, their shoulders hunched against the damp. The rest of Berner Street was left to the quiet, and to whatever shadows might keep their own counsel there. A horse's hoof struck a slow rhythm somewhere beyond the corner. Rain tapped against the brim of Liz's bonnet. She paused once, perhaps to speak to her companion, perhaps to glance down the length of the street, as if considering her next step. What happened next would never be known in full. Dutfield's yard lay beside the club, a narrow entrance from the street that opened into a dim enclosed space. It was used for stabling horses, for storage, for the simple overflow of working life. On that night, the yard's gates were partially open, their hinges squealing softly when the wind moved them. It was there, in that shadowed yard, that Liz's life ended. Her throat was cut in a single precise motion, deep enough to take her breath, quick enough to keep her from crying out. There was no mutilation, no other mark beyond the killing stroke. Some would later argue that the killer had been interrupted. Others believed Liz's murder was unrelated to the others that had shaken Whitechapel. But the hour, the method, and the place in the heart of the East End would bind her name forever to the string of deaths that autumn. At 1 a.m, Louis Deemshoots, a steward of the club, turned his costermonger's barrow into the yard. His pony shied violently, refusing to move forward. When he peered into the gloom, he saw what looked like a dark bundle lying just inside the gate. Reaching down, his fingers met the still warm flesh of Liz's cheek. The alarm went up quickly. Shouts, the pounding of boots, the sudden commotion spilling from the club into the narrow street. Someone ran for a constable. Others crowded the gate, their faces pale under the gaslight. The drizzle had darkened Liz's dress to near black, and her blood pooled on the damp stones. As the police began their work, taking statements and marking the scene, Berner Street seemed to hold its breath. The rain softened to mist. The crowd thinned as the curious were pushed back. Somewhere in the fog, a man slipped away unseen, his coat collar turned high against the chill. The clock had not yet struck 2 when, less than a mile away, another woman stepped into the Ripper's shadow, and when the sun rose on September 30th, Whitechapel would learn that the horror of the night had not been contained to Berner Street. The news of Berner Street had not yet travelled far. Constables were still taking statements, the club's doorway still flanked by curious onlookers, when the night's second act began to unfold. Less than 45 minutes after Elizabeth Stride was found, another woman, walked straight into history. Her name was Catherine Eddowes. To her friends, she was Kate. To her daughter, Mother. And to the East End police, she was a familiar figure, known for her quick wit, sharper tongue, and the tendency to drink more than was wise in streets like these. Kate's last night began much like many before it, in a public house with gin in her glass and laughter in her voice. She was small and wiry, with keen eyes and a face that could switch from warmth to warning in an instant. At 46, she had known her share of hardship, the loss of her husband, the struggle to find steady work, and the constant scrape of poverty's edge. By evening, she had been picked up by the police for public drunkenness, found lying in a doorway on Aldgate High Street singing to herself. Taken to the station, she was given a place to sleep it off in a cell. She might have spent the night there, warm, dry, and out of harm's way, if not for her own stubborn charm. Around 12:55 a.m, the constable on duty deemed her sober enough to leave. As she stepped out into the cool night, she joked, "I'll get a damn fine hiding for this when I get home." She laughed, pulling her shawl tighter, and vanished into the damp streets.
Mitre Square sat deeper in the city of London, a dark triangular space hemmed in by warehouses and the backs of tall buildings. At that hour, it was all but deserted, save for the occasional watchman making his rounds. The square's lamps cast weak pools of yellow light, leaving wide swathes in shadow. At 1:35 a.m, Police Constable Edward Watkins turned the corner into the square and walked straight into a nightmare. There on the cold stones lay Catherine Eddowes. Her throat had been cut deep and savagely. Her abdomen was torn open in a manner so violent it would haunt the minds of all who saw it. This time, there was no question. This was the same hand that had mutilated Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman. The brutality was such that the doctor called to the scene remarked it must have been done by someone with anatomical knowledge, or by someone who had repeated the act enough to learn its grim details. In the flickering lamplight, the horror was almost too much to take in. Within minutes, word spread between the ranks of the Metropolitan Police and the City Police, two separate jurisdictions now faced with the fact that the killer had struck in both territories in the space of an hour. Runners were sent to every nearby beat. Orders were barked, boots hammered over cobblestones. The papers would call it the double event. 2 women dead, their lives ended in the same night by the same unseen hand. The detail that chilled even the most hardened officers was the timing. The killer had likely been in Mitre Square not more than a minute or two before Watkins arrived. Another patrolman, another step taken faster or slower, and he might have been caught in the act. As the police fanned out searching the streets between Berners Street and Mitre Square, one constable spotted something unusual in a doorway along Galston Street, a piece of blood-stained apron. It would later be identified as part of Catherine Eddowes' clothing, cut away and carried by her killer. Above it, scrawled in chalk on the wall, was a cryptic message: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The meaning was debated endlessly. Anti-Semitic sentiment was rife in Whitechapel, and the area's Jewish residents already faced suspicion from some locals. The police, fearing a riot, had the writing erased before daylight. By dawn, Whitechapel and the City of London were electric with fear. 2 murders in one night, both under the noses of the law, meant no one was safe, not even in the better-lit streets of the city. Markets opened late as vendors whispered the latest rumours. Mothers kept their daughters indoors, and in the pubs and lodging houses, speculation ran wild. Who could move so quickly, strike so precisely, and vanish without trace? The name Jack the Ripper had not yet appeared in print, but after this night, it would not be long. The morning after the double event, Whitechapel awoke to more than just grief. It awoke to the beginnings of a legend, though no one would have called it that at the time. In the public houses, the markets, the factories, and the narrow courts, there was only one subject on anyone's lips: the man who had killed 2 women in a single night. The newspapers, smelling blood in more ways than one, wasted no time. broadsheets rolled off the presses with headlines meant to stop readers in their tracks. Whitechapel horror, 2 more women butchered, fiend strikes twice in one night. They spared little in the way of detail. The ink carried every gory rumor the streets could supply, each edition more sensational than the last. Facts blurred with whispers, and whispers hardened into truth by sheer repetition. Just as the papers were stoking public fear, something unusual arrived at the central news agency. A letter written in red ink, addressed "Dear Boss." The handwriting was bold, the tone taunting. "I keep on hearing the police have caught me," it began. "But they won't fix me just yet. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off." It was signed, chillingly, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Within hours, the name was in print. And with that, the killer who had haunted the East End anonymously became something larger. A figure as much imagined as real, the embodiment of the city's darkest fears. Before that letter, the murders had been whispered about as the work of the Whitechapel fiend, the monster or leather apron, the last a nickname born from an early, unfounded suspicion. But Jack the Ripper was different. It was memorable, sharp on the tongue, and it seemed to fit the savagery of the acts. It was also a gift to the press. Columns could now carry a single name, and readers would know instantly who was meant. That name, printed in bold type and repeated in every coffee house and street corner, gave the killer a kind of shadow life.
The name spread faster than the police could investigate. Children dared each other to walk certain streets at night. Housewives bolted their doors and windows, some even barring them with furniture. Men in pubs traded theories and boasted how they'd catch the villain themselves, though most quickened their steps on the way home. The women of Whitechapel, especially those forced to work the streets to survive, carried the weight of that name more heavily than anyone. It made the killer seem closer, more personal, as if he might step from any shadow. With the press hounding them daily, the Metropolitan Police and City Police were now under a scrutiny they had never faced before. Editorials demanded answers, some even accusing the police of incompetence or corruption. Sketch artists rendered the crime scenes in lurid detail. Street hawkers cried the headlines into the fog, another from Jack, Ripper on the loose. Even those who avoided the papers could not escape the voice of the newsboys calling through the streets. By the end of October, Jack the Ripper was no longer just a man, he was an idea. He was the faceless threat in the gaslit streets, the whisper at the back of the neck, the shadow that made every step home a careful one. The murders themselves were still unsolved, but in the court of public opinion, the Ripper's guilt was already certain, and though the police continued their work, the battle was no longer just for justice, it was for control of the story. The press had given the killer his name, the streets had given him his myth, and together they had ensured that Jack the Ripper would never truly vanish from London's memory. The story of Mary Jane Kelly begins, as so many stories in Whitechapel did, in the haze between fact and rumour. She was younger than the others, no more than 25 by most accounts, and strikingly pretty in a way that made her stand out amid the soot and smoke of the East End. Fair hair, pale skin and eyes that caught the light. Some swore they were blue, others insisted green. Whatever the truth, her beauty was often her currency and her undoing. Mary Jane had drifted through life much like the fog that rolled in from the Thames, here one day, gone the next, slipping between places and identities. Born in Limerick, Ireland, or perhaps in Wales, depending on which of her own stories one believed, she was said to have lived in Cardiff, in Paris, in the West End, before finding herself in the narrow lanes of Spitalfields. She spoke of fine dresses and grand company in her past, of drinking champagne from crystal, of rooms with velvet curtains, though whether these memories were true or a balm against harsher realities? No one could say. By 1888, Mary Jane was living in a cramped single room at 13 Miller's Court, a cul-de-sac off Dorset Street. Her rent was a few shillings a week, paid, when it could be, to her landlord, John McCarthy. The room was small, cold, and sparsely furnished. A bed, a rickety table, a few chairs, and a washstand. A curtain hung in place of a proper door to the tiny closet that held her few belongings. The fireplace worked only when coaxed with precious coal. Thursday, November 8th, 1888. Dawned with a brittle chill. Mary Jane was seen several times that day wrapped in an old shawl, her hair tucked under a bonnet. She spoke to friends and acquaintances in passing, visited a local pub and tried, without success, to borrow money for rent. There was a weariness in her voice, according to those who saw her, but not despair. In the afternoon, she was spotted walking along Commercial Street, arm in arm with a man, perhaps a client, perhaps just company for the cold walk. The two were seen entering her room at Miller's Court, though the man left before evening. As darkness fell, Mary Jane was drawn into the life of Spitalfields by night, the warmth and light of the 10 bells, the murmur of voices in smoky corners, the press of bodies escaping the November cold. She drank gin most likely and sang, her voice clear and pleasant enough to turn a head or two. She was heard to sing an Irish ballad, a violet from Mother's grave, a tune both sweet and sorrowful, and one that clung to the memory of those who heard it that night. Sometime around midnight, she was seen near her room speaking with another man. Neighbours would later describe him as well-dressed, carrying a parcel, his manner calm. Together, they walked toward Miller's Court, disappearing from sight. At about 1 in the morning, a neighbour heard singing from behind Mary Jane's thin walls, perhaps the same ballad from earlier. The voice rose and fell, sometimes strong, sometimes fading, until it was silenced altogether. After that, Miller's Court went quiet, save for the occasional sound of footsteps on the cobbles outside, the rustle of wind against the shutters, and the distant hiss of rain beginning to fall. The night passed. No one saw Mary Jane leave. No one saw anyone else enter, or so they thought. Just after 10 o'clock, Mary Jane's landlord sent his assistant Thomas Bowyer to collect the overdue rent. Bowyer knocked on her door and got no reply. He knocked again, harder. Silence. Stepping to the side window, he pulled back the thin curtain and peered in. What he saw sent him reeling back into the street. Mary Jane was dead, and not merely dead, but unrecognizably so. The violence in that room surpassed anything yet seen in the Rippers' murders. The walls, the bedding, the floor, all bore the signs of a killing that had been both frenzied and deliberate. It was as if the killer had taken his time, the privacy of her room allowing for a level of horror not possible in the open streets. By midday, Dorset Street was swarming with police, reporters, and onlookers kept at bay by constables. News spread with a speed that only tragedy seems to carry, and the name Jack the Ripper was whispered and shouted in equal measure. For many in Whitechapel, Mary Jane Kelly's death felt like an ending. Not because the fear had passed, but because the sheer brutality of it convinced them the killer had reached some dreadful climax. Others feared it meant he was only beginning. Either way, the East End would never be quite the same. In the days following Mary Jane Kelly's murder, Whitechapel became a living crime scene. Dorset Street swelled with reporters, gawkers, and the ever-present fog that now seemed thicker, heavier, as if it too had borne witness to what lay behind that window. Constables kept the curious at arm's length, but rumours slipped through the cordon like wind through a cracked door. The newspapers wasted no time in framing the scene. "The most ghastly murder in the annals of crime," screamed one headline. Others printed grim illustrations,
each more lurid than the last. For the press, the autumn of terror had reached its dark crescendo. Scotland Yard poured men into the case. Inspectors Frederick Aberline, Edmund Reed, and others walked the same narrow lanes the killer had once prowled, questioning anyone who might have seen something, anything, on that final night. But leads grew cold almost as quickly as they were found. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly posed a fresh problem. Unlike the previous killings, which had taken place in the open streets, this one had occurred indoors. There were no passing witnesses, no chance of interruption, and, most damning for the police, no way to determine exactly when the killer had come and gone. And so the speculation began. Over the weeks that followed, the public latched onto names, each whispered with equal certainty and doubt. Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher whose suicide in December 1888 sparked theories that the Ripper had ended his own life after the final murder. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant and barber known for mental instability and misogynistic rants, who would later be committed to an asylum. George Chapman, a poisoner and serial wife killer, whose later crimes bore no resemblance to the Ripper's, but whose presence in Whitechapel at the time kept suspicion alive. Francis Tumblety, a quack American doctor with a hatred for women and a knack for vanishing when the law came close. The Royal Conspiracy, a story so extravagant it read like fiction, implicating a member of the royal family, his physician, and a ring of co-conspirators in a cover-up. Each name had its believers, each had its detractors, and none could be proven. The press had been receiving letters from the supposed killer since before Polly Nichols' murder had faded from the front page. Most were obvious hoaxes, but a few, especially the ones signed Jack the Ripper, had taken on a life of their own. The Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jack postcard, the From Hell letter with its grisly half-kidney, these fueled the image of the Ripper as not just a killer, but a man who toyed with the police and the public alike. But whether these words were truly his or the work of some clever, malicious imposter has never been proven.
By the winter of 1889, the motors had stopped. Whitechapel breathed, not in relief, but in wary uncertainty. Some believed the killer had been caught and quietly put away. Others thought he had died or fled London. And some feared he was still there, watching, waiting. The streets returned to their rhythm, but the rhythm had changed. Women glanced over their shoulders more often. Men kept their eyes on the ground. Constables walked their beats with the knowledge that the most infamous killer in London's history had slipped past them time and again. The name Jack the Ripper had taken root, a grim brand burned into the city's memory. And yet the man behind the name remained, and still remains, as insubstantial as the fog that never lifted from the East End. In the years since, thousands of theories have been put forward, each promising the final answer, each eventually crumbling under the weight of doubt. The Ripper has been cast as a doctor, a butcher, a sailor, a member of the gentry, even a woman. But the truth remains locked in the narrow streets of Whitechapel, in the shadows between gaslight and darkness. And perhaps that is why his legend endures, not because of what is known, but because of what will never be known. He did not vanish into thin air. He simply walked away, as any man might, swallowed whole by the fog and the press of the crowd. And so the autumn of 1888 passed into winter. The fog rolled in and out of Whitechapel's streets, and time, as it always does, began to sweep away the blood, the whispers, and the living memory of those nights. But the shadow of Jack the Ripper never left. It lingered, not in the alleyways, but in the minds of those who wondered what evil truly looks like when it wears the face of a man. Today, Whitechapel is a different place. The cobbles are paved over in many streets, the gas lamps replaced with electric light,
Glass and steel rise where once stood soot-stained brick. The docks are quieter now, the markets cleaner and the lanes better lit. But if you stand in certain corners on a cold autumn evening, when the mist drapes low and the air smells faintly of rain and iron, you might still feel it, that thin chill on the back of your neck. Because the Ripper's London was never just a place. It was a mood, a weight in the air. The knowledge that danger can live right alongside you, buying bread in the same market, passing you on the same narrow street, and you'd never know until it was too late. The legend has grown over the years, bigger than the man himself. Historians dissect the facts, armchair detectives pore over faded photographs, and tourists walk the so-called Ripper's Trail, with maps and mugs of tea in hand. But the real Whitechapel of 1888, the damp, the hunger, the noise, the desperation, is harder to conjure. It lives only in the faint echoes of testimony and the thin, crackling pages of old police files. And perhaps that is the greatest cruelty of all. The killer's name endures, but the names of his victims fade. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. They were daughters, mothers, friends. They laughed, they loved, they survived longer than most thought they might, until one man's shadow fell across their path. We do not speak their names from morbid fascination, but because they deserve to be remembered. The Ripper may have vanished, melting back into the night without a trace, but the fear he inspired still curls, like the fog of the East End, through London's history, and there, no doubt, will most likely linger forever. Thanks for listening. This has been Fireside Crime Stories, where the darkest tales are always read by Firelight. If you haven't already, subscribe. And before you drift off, toss a little fuel on the fire. Hit that like button. Ring that bell, so when the shadows shift again, you'll be the first to know that another fire's burning and another story's being told. Until next time, rest well.